Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. When I asked in my Christmas video about your opinion on my series of A Bit of Orange, the response was overwhelmingly in favor of my continuing with the series, but perhaps not by plowing through the whole thing at once. So for now, I will alternate videos, one orange, one other. Today I'm looking at Genesis Apologetics again. This time they're trying to debunk natural selection. Now, they seem to be under the impression that all it takes to debunk something is to say it while making a goofy face. So let's go!
What are we studying today?
Natural selection. I've already started reading it. There's a great definition in our biology textbook. So, natural selection is the process by which organisms with variation most suited to their local environment survive and leave more offspring.
So, evolutionary theory holds that natural selection is one of the forces that drives evolution.
How's that work?
Well, evolutionists say a mutation happens in the sex cells of a creature and its offspring exhibits the resulting trait difference, like a new feather color or something. The trait can give it an advantage or a disadvantage. A beneficial mutation would cause it to become a little better at surviving in an environment than the non-mutants. So, its descendants, and thus the trait, eventually outnumber the others. Then the scenario repeats with another variation, supposedly driving evolution forward.
I have no major problems with your description of natural selection there. So far, so good.
But rather than this process producing just the varieties we see among animal kinds, they believe this process built those animals from completely different ones.
And now we have issues. It's not that it built an animal from a completely different animal, it's that the populations of animals change over time, with the favored mutations becoming more prolific and changes accumulating until a population that exists generations after the original is different enough to be considered a distinct species. Now keep in mind that most macroorganisms on the planet have half or more of their genome identical to each other, suggesting that it all started with some certain basics like cell structures and functions, and then mutations and natural selection built on top of these basics. I mean, why else would our genome be 60% banana?
And can eventually lead to one kind of animal turning into another.
Not one kind turning into another, whatever kind may mean in this context, but a population slowly changing as it adapts to its environment. It's not like one day an ant hatched with wings, and thus was born a fly! It's a very, very slow process, and these favorable genes usually only offer a marginal survival advantage to an individual. But if the trait is inherited, then its survival advantage becomes amplified over time as the original mutant's ancestors are more fit to survive in their environment.
But this has never been observed. Fish are still fish, and finches are still finches.
What about mudskippers, lungfish, and blennies? Actually, there's a lot more than those, but these are fish that can spend a significant amount of time out of water. Some blenny species even spend more time out of water than in the water. Morphologically, it's clearly a fish, but it certainly doesn't act like one. It's not hard to imagine it developing firmer fins to help navigate on dry land in much the same way a finch's beak evolves, which is the microevolution that you agree is possible. How different do the fins have to be before you admit that it's no longer a fish? All they have to do is get a bit firmer, maybe a little bit longer, and boom, you have rudimentary legs. This is exactly how we think land animals first evolved, and since we can see it happening today, it seems like a reasonable hypothesis to me.
And here in the biology textbook, they point out that the polar bear had the advantage as a predator in the snow because of its white coat.
I don't understand. Are you disagreeing with the fact that blending into your surroundings can help with hunting?
And it also shows that if you start with yellow and green grasshoppers, two different traits inherited from the parents, the green may outnumber the yellow in a green environment because they are harder for birds to see and catch.
Yeah, these are great examples of how once a trait develops, it can help a creature survive. But I'd be willing to bet that you're about to ask how a grasshopper knew to turn green or some idiotic straw man like that.
So, did the grasshoppers think through how other animals would avoid it if it looked more camouflage?
Sometimes I am super disappointed in how predictable you guys can be.
Did it know how to genetically engineer itself to express those colors? Did a polar bear engineer its own white coat?
No, but that's not what evolutionists believe.
Well, kudos to you for admitting that it's a straw man, but why even bring it up if you know that it's not even close to what anyone thinks about evolution?
They think that these changes happen randomly in the DNA, influencing an individual's survivability.
Sure, close enough.
Evolution is a blind process, no offense. Intelligent choices supposedly have nothing to do with it.
Well, that depends very highly on what you mean by intelligent choices. I mean, once intelligence develops as a trait, then definitely intelligent choices by that organism will aid in its survival.
Evolutionists believe natural selection figured out how to design an eye.
Well, not figured out, since natural selection isn't a conscious process. I mean, if you believe that a deity of some sort was acting through natural selection, then I guess you could word it that way, but there's really no evidence for that position. More like natural selection favored organisms with traits that resembled rudimentary eyes, and once rudimentary eyes became common, the ones who mutated in ways to improve on those rudimentary eyes were then granted the survival advantage.
But how? It would have to build and preserve over who knows how many generations, hundreds of complicated interacting eye parts, including proteins that were all useless until the whole package was eventually assembled.
I'll let Dawkins take on this one. He explains it a bit better than I can myself.
You start by being able to tell whether there's a shadow, whether it's night or day. Shadow's useful. That could be a predator moving overhead in the sea. Night or day is obviously useful for all sorts of purposes. Then you could imagine a cup. Instead of just having a flat sheet of light-sensitive cells, the edges turn up into a cup. Now the cup means that if there's light coming from that direction, it hits that part of the eye. If there's light coming from that direction, it hits that part of the eye. So already the animal can tell the direction from which light is coming and the direction from which a shadow is coming. So we haven't got an image yet. All we've got is the direction of light. Now the cup can steadily and slowly over evolutionary time close over until you end up with a little hole at the top. And the little hole at the top, the same principles working all the way, that light coming from that direction hits that part of the retina, and from that direction hits this part of the retina, but because there's a hole, it's rather more precisely, not exactly focused, but light from there hits there, light from there hits there, light from there hits there, because it's got to get through the hole. We're moving towards a pinhole camera. Now a pinhole camera, if you make the hole small enough, and remember we're having a smooth gradient of closing up the hole, if you make the hole small enough, then it makes a sharp, focused image. The trouble with a pinhole camera is that the image is very dim because very little light can get through the pinhole. What you need is a lens. Because what a lens does is gather light from different directions and focus it on a point. Instead of it having to go right through the middle of the hole, it can be gathered from a wider range of sources. Now, a lens is not difficult to arrange. Any old chunk of transparent gubbins will do the job better than a pinhole. So once again, we've got a slow, gradual improvement. Any old lump of gubbins, transparent, is better than nothing, and then the lens simply improves its shape gradually. It's got to be gradually. Every step has got to be a slight improvement over the previous one. You get a lens.
And now that we've heard the explanation, I'm also going to recommend watching a demonstration that Dawkins did when he was quite a bit younger, where he actually shows how each stage of the eye is progressively better.
How'd it know to engineer animals for flight?
Well, there are two main hypotheses, as the from the ground up and the from the trees down hypotheses. I haven't really looked into the ground up version, but the trees down one makes perfect sense to me. Have a group of climbing theropods that make their nests in trees, give them feathers for warmth, and what do you know? These feathers also slow down their descent should they fall out of the tree, and increasing their chance of surviving a fall. Natural selection then works very slowly to favor the ones that have feathers that slow the fall the greatest, along with the ones who have an instinct to flap while falling. Eventually you get something that can make short flights, and as it progresses you end up with a fully fledged bird.
Or a navigation system so tiny it can fit in the head of a monarch butterfly, which is smaller than a pin.
We don't have a definitive answer for that one. At least not one that I could find. But you know what? Scientists are working on it. They didn't just give up and say, must be God.
How'd it wire a human brain that's far more complicated than our best computers if it is a totally blind process with no goal or purpose in view?
Well, that one's a bit more complex than I have time to get into at the moment, and again, there doesn't look like there is one clear answer of this is exactly how we know brains originally evolved, but also again, scientists are working on it. Can you imagine how primitive we would still be if everyone just accepted that if we didn't understand something, it must have been a god?
You're right. Natural selection is just a process. It doesn't have a brain. It can't think or design. It had no foreknowledge of what it was trying to accomplish.
Right. It is a natural process, not a thinking force of some kind. It didn't design the organisms we see today any more than wind, rain, and tectonic activity designed the mountains. And it had no foreknowledge of what it was trying to accomplish because it wasn't trying to accomplish anything. Just as Niagara Falls wasn't trying to carve out the Niagara Gorge, it just happened.
And yet, coupled with mutations, it's been assigned godlike powers to create things way beyond man's understanding.
Yes! It's like they've replaced God's power with random mutations and natural selection.
As I said earlier, you are welcome to believe that God's power manifests in mutations and natural selection if you like, but mutation and natural selection are both facts. They happen. Creationists usually even agree that they happen to some degree. You saying it incredulously with those ridiculous expressions on your faces doesn't invalidate it.
As the textbook points out, it favors a creature's overall ability to survive, but the actual changes are happening deep down in the creature on a microscopic level inside the genes.
Have you ever heard of gene expression? Simply put, it describes how genes express themselves in a phenotype. An easy example would be that the gene that controls eye color expresses itself in the color of your eyes. Pretty easy concept, right? So why are you surprised that a change to a gene can also change how a gene expresses itself? That's some pretty basic biology right there. Like, this is the basic stuff that's taught in school before they even separate the sciences into multiple courses. I think I learned about Mendel's P's in grade 9. In fact, this is the stuff they give to the teachers to teach who don't necessarily specialize in science. It was in the class where I learned about Mendel's P's that I also learned about alleles, and as a result, to this day it still sounds weird to me to hear them called alleles.
Wait. So you're saying that when certain individuals die, all their genes just go away?
Not necessarily. I mean, all the genes that were mutations unique to them just go away. Otherwise, copies of the same gene are kept alive in other members of the population.
Meaning that natural selection has no power in selecting individual genes?
How does that even follow? As a hypothetical, just picture an event in an environment which causes one member of a population to die, while another member of the same population but with slightly different genes survives. Natural selection has just now selected the individual genes that helped the surviving organism live through whatever event killed the other one. Is that not natural selection, selecting an individual gene? Now, in reality, it usually would be some combination of genes working together that aid in survival, but that's just because there are so many genes floating around the planet nowadays. Back in the time before we diversified into so many different multi- and unicellular organisms, I'm sure there were times when natural selection favored genes at an individual level. But either way, what does it matter? Who cares if natural selection works on more than one gene at a time? All that means is that, if anything, it works faster when more genes are present.
Well, it can't see genes, just whole organisms.
Yeah, and do you know what makes an organism what it is? It's genes. Also, if you want to get really nitpicky, it can't see anything any more than the river sees the canyon that it's carving. That's it for now. Their video goes on for quite a bit longer, but I'm keeping this one short as this is a very busy time of year for me, both personally and at work. So Happy New Year! I'm not really one for New Year's resolutions, but this year I want to start giving a bit more money to charity, so I'm going to go in for some atheist tithing. From now on, 10% of all the money that I make from anything YouTube related will be going to a good secular charity or two. I haven't quite decided which ones yet, but Doctors Without Borders will probably be one of my top choices. So remember to follow me on Twitter and support me on Patreon. See you next time!